All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Eddie Ciliendo, and I'm the CEO of 21CS. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the Resiliency Bootcamp for IT professionals. I'm being joined by two industry experts, Carlos Recalde, the CEO and president of Sheltered Harbor, as well as Rebecca Levesque, the chief revenue officer at 21CS. You know, the word bootcamp brings me back to my Army days. Brings back memories of rain, snow, and mud, shouting, and a lot of running. I promise you, during today's webinar, there will be no foul weather, there will be no shouting or running. What we will do, however, is we'll take a deeper look at Sheltered Harbor, why I strongly believe that it is crucial for our industry, and then what Sheltered Harbor and cyber resilience in general means for the mainframe. 21CS joined the Sheltered Harbor Alliance a little over a year ago because we strongly believe in the importance of what Sheltered Harbor does in the mission of Sheltered Harbor, but also because we believed that it is important to have a strong participation of the mainframe industry, mainframe technology in Sheltered Harbor. As many of you know, 45 of the 50 largest banks around the world rely on their mainframe for their core processing, right? So we believe that it is crucial on one side to have technology participation from mainframe companies in Sheltered Harbor, but then also for you professionals in the mainframe space to understand what Sheltered Harbor is and what the goals of Sheltered Harbor are. Just a few words about 21CS. We're a software company in the mainframe space. We have a global presence so that we can support customers around the globe. We've been around a little over 30 years and focus on a variety of mainframe software solutions in the data management, data protection, and cyber resiliency space. Just a couple of admin things that I wanted to mention before we get going. Please note that this is a live session. The session is going to be recorded. We will be sending out the recording and the presentation after this webinar. It is a live session, so I already apologize for any bloopers or technical glitches we may have, but we wanted to make the session live so we can make it interactive. So please do use the chat function while Carlos and Rebecca are presenting. You should find it at the bottom of your screen. Enter your questions, and then we'll open up the microphone for everybody at the end of the session to answer any and all questions that you could have. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Carlos. Carlos, we're looking forward to learning more about Sheltered Harbor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I look forward to hearing some of your input. Hopefully, we get some dialogue going. I want to start with Sheltered Harbor. Real quick background. We are a not-for-profit setup with a specific mission. And that mission is to maintain public confidence in the financial sector should a financial institution get operationally wiped out by a cyber attack or other catastrophic event. One could easily understand that CrowdStrike was not a cyber attack, but it was certainly a cyber incident that caused serious problems in a hurry. I'm going to go ahead and flip slides here and move on to just fundamentally what we mean by that. We provide, as an industry body, some industry standards and guides, and we inevitably provide certification that the implementations of what the industry has determined is necessary to survive a devastating cyber attack are implemented properly. So for that, we rely on our three pillars. First and foremost is making sure that we have a copy of the data that allows us to know who are the customers of that institution and what are the assets involved. That means that every single day we're putting this aside, or more often if necessary. If we're not ready for an attack, we're never going to be able to survive it. Part of being ready is making sure that the institution itself is ready to recover very quickly, whatever are critical services, And we require that institutions have resilience plans. And it's not that we require, we actually advocate for exactly what's required in those resilience plans and how we go about testing that, in fact, they are legitimate. And fundamentally, the last thing that we do is we provide certifications for organizations to ensure that, in fact, the right data is in the vault and can be counted on the worst of days, and that the plans, in fact, have been not only put in place, but are well exercised so that the institution can recover quickly. All of this is about recovering critical services very fast. And it's a little bit different than disaster recovery in that sense. I'm going to spend a little bit more time first just painting the scenario. I think we all understand it, but I want to paint it a little bit more clearly so we understand what Sheltered Harbor is doing for the industry and ideally what we want each institution to prepare for. So on a given day, let's pretend it's 10:15 in the morning, people are operating, reliant on their bank. Bank is operating, everything is perfectly fine, when suddenly something goes boom. The industry is used to something going boom. So the first thing I want to underscore is financial services by nature has resiliency in its DNA. Everything is redundant. Everything is fast failover. You know, a network goes down, not an issue. There's an alternate network that comes right back in its place. We're very good at being able to recover quickly. Unfortunately, in the new world where everything is completely connected, including our alternate or backup systems, a cyber incident can be one that bypasses our intentions here of resilience and fundamentally says as soon as I affect one side of a system, all sides, including backups, alternates, and so forth, are equally affected. So that's the scenario Sheltered Harbor was designed for. In this case, the boom is serious. It's not one that the institution can come back from quickly. We call this a severe but plausible event. We used to say plausible when we were founded 9 years ago. Now it's a severe and likely event. In this event, the data is destroyed. It's locked up, it's corrupted. We hear ransomware all of the time, and it affects primary and secondary systems. And oh, by the way, we've already learned it absolutely affects your backups. Organizations get held for ransom, discover that their backups are either not there or completely corrupted. Additionally, our command and control and transaction processing systems are probably unavailable. Our database administrators can't get our own data. This is a scenario that is not looking very good and pretty messy in the middle of the day. Here's the biggest issue. Customers are disconnected from their assets. They can't get to their funds. This is the scenario Sheltered Harbor was looking at, saying, okay, what do we need to do to minimally put up enough operations that we can stem the panic that's inevitable from this scenario? And Sheltered Harbor basically said, all right, let's look at that, say, what are the critical things we need? And fundamentally, how long is it before customers can reconnect to their assets? If we can make that happen quickly, we're going to be able to maintain public confidence. And for that, we said there's two critical services in the case of a bank. And this is a scenario I'm painting right now. Just for a bank, the scenario could apply for any other financial institution. In the case of a bank, we said, all right, customers must be able to see their balances. That means they must have confidence the institution has an operational problem, but my funds, my assets are fine. They must be able to get access to those funds very quickly. In fact, Sheltered Harbor said, let's do that within 24 hours. If, for whatever the reason, and in the devastating cyber attack, likely, our business continuity disaster recovery plans go into effect and determine this is a bigger deal than we thought, it's going to take us longer to recover. That is what Sheltered Harbor and the industry has deemed a Sheltered Harbor event. And for this, we have to have a different answer because our business continuity plan is going to take 3 or 4 days to come back. What do we do in the interim? In this scenario, fast recovery of critical services is what's going to allow us to survive. It's going to, what is going to allow us to maintain public confidence. So, speed is of the essence. Resilience requires that we focus exclusively on critical services. If our intent is to recover the entire institution, it's going to take too long. Too many systems to recover, too much data to move, not fast enough. We need to be a lot shorter about that. And for this, we introduced the concept of what is now known as a minimal viable operation, minimal viable bank, minimal viable insurer, or whatever the institution is. And to achieve this, we have to say, okay, the absolute minimum that's good enough to allow us to survive, because our business continuity plan is going to do the real work of truly recovering everything back to normal. And it's possible that even though we determine what's minimally viable, we even have to cut that into say, okay, this is an alternate process to make that available. In the case of a bank, for example, we talk about making balance information available. Well, it turns out there's lots of ways that we're used to getting our balances over the phone, on our mobile device, by going to a website, by walking into a branch. All of these are different ways to get balance information. Can we support all of those instantly within 24 hours? Maybe, maybe not. The institution has determined what can they get done fast enough and define that's the process we're going to use on this interim basis. I talked about vaulting data. It was the first thing the Sheltered Harbor did as an industry initiative, was define a set of standards about vaulting data. And the first thing was to determine what's truly a cyber resilient vault. What are the characteristics that must exist for us to be absolutely sure that the data we critically need is positively available on that day? How do we ensure that, in fact, what went into that vault is exactly what we needed and nothing else, and didn't get tainted along the way? For that, we want secure processes that not only pull data into the vault, but processes that pull data out of the vault. And lastly, we have to be able to recover them in an environment that is now not what was up before, an alternate platform. And we want to recover that in a platform that's completely disconnected from the original platform, and therefore has a completely different security environment, different login credentials, for instance. We call it zero trusted because there's no trust from the alternate platform that we're using to recover data than there was from the original platform, because if there was, they're not truly isolated, and there's the potential that whatever affected the primary system is also affecting the vault. These are characteristics of vaulting that Sheltered Harbor has defined in depth in their specifications, and that we enforce in our certifications. Similarly, we talk about the plans. How do we become resilient? And here in the end, Sheltered Harbor wants to test that this is the case. Sheltered Harbor wants proof that the institution is ready to do this. And we've discovered that, resilience is not an individual endeavor. You can't just hand this over to the technologists and say, here, build my resilience plan, any more than you could hand this over to the tellers and ask them to build the resilience plan. Neither of those are going to be sufficient. It needs to be a collective, typically with decisions, strategies set by the top of the organization, by the C-suite, that can be ratified and formalized and approved inevitably in some cases by a board, as to when do we determine that we need to go to an alternate platform? And if we did, how do we have to react? In order to do that, everything about a resilience plan has to have been anticipated. We have to know exactly in this scenario how we would act. We had to have planned for how we're going to make that happen. We had to have designed the alternate methods or tested alternate methods. We have to implement or negotiate, assuming there are third parties involved, to get that ready. All of this has to happen ahead of time, not on the day of. We have to have tested and validated this. For example, if this is a bank and we're going to rely on ATM cards for people to draw funds out of their account, that ATM network has to now know that the balances are coming from an alternate platform and not the primary that's still down. These are examples of things that need to happen, and inevitably, the institution has to be able to rehearse this so that on the day that this happens, we can turn our processes around onto this alternate platform in 24 hours or less, meaning there has to be muscle memory in there. Everything about this has to be automatic. Sheltered Harbor looks for that in order to inevitably convey a certification of resilience. That's the introduction of the scenario we're looking at, and I'm going to pass this over now so that we can hear a little bit more about how 21CS is helping us do this.
So Sheltered Harbor on Z and the Z environment is critical to the businesses. And why? Well, for the exact same reason that Eddie stated in his opening remarks. 45 of 50 of the world's largest banks run on Z. And a lot of their critical core infrastructure around their resiliency and their ability to do what they do is sitting on this platform. So business services that are critical to running their banks, their insurances, their businesses in the financial sector are on a platform that we really need to consider if we're going to complete this whole picture that Sheltered Harbor has. And speed is of the essence. And because of that, IBM Z today has solutions in place that will allow the Z customer to feel confident that they can actually run in one of these events, as Carlos describes them. But the data size and the complexity on Z is growing. It's not a shrinking platform. It's not going away. It is actually a platform of size and consequence that a lot of customers are really putting a lot of work on. They trust it. It does a lot of things well and quickly. But when it is running, a lot of the applications and a lot of the business data is intertwined and interconnected in and of itself. And so that complexity needs to be understood, because the threats that are evolving are just that, evolving. And they're really going after certain specific areas of your infrastructure that they feel is weakness. Many of these threats are unfortunately very pointed, very segmented. They're looking for weakness. But in other areas, like CrowdStrike, that was mentioned earlier, these threats can be accidental and they happen. But because of the size and the complexity that we are running on Z, we really need to be thinking about this in a different way. And not only because of size and complexity, but also because of regulations across the globe, because of the Basel Committee that met in 2021. We have laws in country after country after country that are very specific to exactly the threats that Sheltered Harbor is bringing to bear. Regulations are growing. The need for businesses with even out regulations to be able to address the growing threats is emerging. And doing this with homegrown, outdated, and even siloed approaches doesn't cut it anymore. I was speaking with a customer the other day, and very much a siloed organization. Different people within the organization looked at their environments from different perspectives, and they all thought that they were in a good way. But unfortunately, because of the issues at hand, they were looking at it in a way that really didn't bring about the best results for their applications, their business services, and what was important to the business. So this is no longer a technology decision. This is really about having a business and a corporate-wide, unsiloed view of how are we going to recover when the chips are down. So resiliency in general, as was already noted, requires an extremely comprehensive planning and using the right technologies. We have to put people, processes, tools, storage, hardware, all of it together. And in an unsiloed approach, really bring all of those pieces together. But we have to plan it. We have to test it. And within the IBM technology suite, there are different tools that are used. For instance, on the IBM Z platform, we already know, many of us, we talk about cyber resiliency. We talk about immutable copies. We talk about having a quote unquote cyber vault in which you're using storage, hardware, software, services to really help identify and bring and have that immutable zero trust copy that was spoken to earlier by Carlos. But in order for you to be able to use that, you have to be able to test against it. You need to be able to practice all the things that he mentioned. You need to be able to say, hey, I have the applications, I have the data, I have the pieces I need to be able to recover from that immutable copy. So how does 21CS fit into that? Well, within the immutable copy itself, a tool called IBM Z Backup Resiliency is the tool that is used by IBM, that 21CS actually develops for IBM, that allows the customer, the business, to identify all the data in every one of those copies that they have in their immutable location, be able to know how it's being used, when it's being used, an actual catalog. So when they need specific data from those copies, in order to be able to recover and bring their businesses back as quickly as possible, they're able to do that with the use of IZBR. IZBR also provides in that immutable copy the ability for you to understand what data sets are at risk. Now, there's a lot of technical mumbo jumbo that goes on, of course, but when we talk about testing it and really making this environment work, we need to have all of the pieces. And that means the silos come down, we understand the data at risk, and we assist in making sure that we not only bring up the infrastructure and only specific applications, but the ones that are actually going to make sure the business is able to meet the standards of the sheltered harbor. And one of those areas of business are being able to have the access to the funds and to the assets. And for the customer able to know how much funds they have. That requires the databases, but that also requires that the transactional integrity and the work that's done through batch to keep all that data updated is able to run as well. So that is a critical aspect of where the tooling within the IBM Z ecosystem is very clearly needed, and IZBR is a strong part of it. But then we also have to have tools in place like ZOS Change Tracker that allow us to control and manage the changes in configuration. Well, why is that? Well, because a lot of the areas in which we need to concern ourselves with in an event are where are the vectors in which the bad actors can come in. Well, one of the areas is from a sysprog perspective. So do we know all the changes in that area? Are we able to see them, manage them, audit them, and then be able to recover? Surgical recovery could be a PDS member that you have in your immutable copy that you need in order to get your operations run, but you only know that because you put tools in place to understand the changes that have been made, and you've been auditing it, and you're able to use the different tools. So you can see modernizing, using new tools, using processes that will allow you to use those immutable copies in a smart way are always necessary. But along with that, we have to be smart. We have to be able to have encryption in place. For me, the immutable copies are our ability to recover from the event. The pervasive encryption and the encryption strategies put another level in place to allow us, when people want to have access to that data, to protect ourselves from it. Also, one of the areas that pervasive encryption in particular protects us from is another area in which a vector or someone from a zero trust would be looking for: your storage admins. Storage admins have significant power in the ability of what they have access to. And pervasive encryption allows us to put that trust level at a level in which they only see the data and that they need to, and are only able to do the things within that data that they need to. So putting the strength in place in advance is the encryption component. So the right technology is the immutable copy. The ability to use that immutable copy is with the right tools in order to bring back the applications that you need in order for the business to have a focused recovery, as Sheltered Harbor is prescribing. And in order to do that in a way that's quick and efficient, and to know where all that data is in all those snapshots that you're taking in that cyber vault, is through IZBR's ability to show you all the data in 3D virtual catalog and recover it through surgical recovery. And those tools are needed because of the fact that when you're looking at a mainframe and you're looking at a Z environment, those immutable copies are taken. All the data is in your cyber vault, all your production data. And so when you want to make concise decisions, you're going to need to be able to have a tool that provides you the inventory to do that. Now, of course, all this comprehensive planning and all this ability to have the right tools in place really is joining all the other pieces that Sheltered Harbor is bringing to the table. And so at this point, I bring Carlos back in, I bring Eddie back in, and hopefully we've spawned a few questions to come up that hopefully we can answer for you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Carlos. There was one question, I think actually a great question that Carlos answered in the chat, but I just want to quickly repeat the question for everybody here. Neil asked, in terms of data protection resiliency, how much of a threat do you see social engineering's techniques to be compared to hacking? And I think, again, it's a great question. I'll let Carlos chime in and give his response. But, social engineering is one of those vectors that catches in probably one of our most vulnerable spaces, right? Both Carlos and Rebecca mentioned that we've been getting really, really good over the years of making sure that we can sustain system outages. We're good at disaster recovery. We're good at hardening our systems. But what about an insider attack? Or what about if somebody's being tricked into an insider attack? I mean, I just would like to remind everybody on the data breaches at both Uber and NVIDIA. It happened, I think, about 2 years ago. I mean, both very, very big, very, very sophisticated IT companies, right? And both were hacked. Both were actually hacked by teenagers, by the Lapsus hacking group. And the way they did it was exactly via social engineering, right? So that is a critical attack vector that we need to be able to protect ourselves from. And again, hence why the sheltered harbor approach is so crucial, and hence why tools like COS Change Tracker that Rebecca talked about are so crucial.
If I could add a quick comment to that as well, I think zero trust is a must. And that's where all of the tools and all of the pieces that we are talking about are critical. Because of the social engineering component of it, unfortunately, that immutable copy that we're keeping could be the copy that was just before that event happened. And so zero trust helps prevent it, but the immutable copies that we're talking about and getting our businesses up and running, unfortunately, are going to be more and more necessary as these bad actors get better and better at what they're doing.
Yeah, if I can add. So first off, we all know that social engineering is a problem. The fact is that the weakest link in any of our systems is typically the individual, the humans. We are subject to mistakes, and we are subject to, in some cases, just bad judgment. You click a link you shouldn't have clicked. You could be trained 1,000,000 times not to do this, and we don't consciously think about sometimes saying, okay, that looks good, and you don't know what that click triggers, and that could trigger entry into a system that you have access to that nobody else needs to have access to. However, clicking that link just gave somebody else access to things that they shouldn't have. So, training our staff is critical, but equally to the concept of zero trust, it's more critical that we have built our environments, all of our environments, production and vaults, to zero trust. So it's not easy for somebody who gets in to make lateral movements to additional platforms or additional environments. All of this takes time, but in the case of vaulting, Sheltered Harbor has advocated for zero trust and complete isolation. We accomplished that with a whole series of tests, and 21CS and their tools help make this possible. But initially, we used to call it air-gapped. We wanted to have all our data vaulted in an air-gapped solution. And I'm talking about literally, that's 9 years ago at this point. Within about a year or so, we changed it to air-gapped sliced isolated, because we realized you can isolate data in a vault without a physical air gap. There are logical ways of doing this, but anybody's guess at what's a good isolation needs to be tested. Sheltered Harbor has very specific specifications for exactly how we measure that, and certification is not granted unless all characteristics of a cyber resilient vault exist. Isolation is the very first and most critical. The secure, immutable vault is critical. Immutable means that nobody could have changed what you put in there, and we have to be able to prove that as well. And 21CS helps us with example. One of the ways that we prove that is with the encryption that we do of that data. In this case, the data in the mainframe itself gets encrypted in a form that proves whether or not has been tampered with after the fact. These are the tools that 21CS brings to help implement a sheltered harbor defined environment. I want to, rather than talking, open up the floor for additional questions. And you can either ask to be unmuted or type your question in text. We're happy to respond.
Yeah, and I think there are two questions. One anonymous. How is Sheltered Harbor different from DORA and other international regulations that are being implemented? And I think that's a great question for both you, Carlos, because I know you're also working with regulatory bodies, not just in the US, but across the world. And I know, Rebecca, you are our resident expert on DORA. So why don't I hand over to you?
Thank you. So first, yes, Sheltered Harbor we were born out of a public-private exercise. That meant that our stakeholders are our funders, which is the private side. But the silent stakeholders, actually not so silent, they have had a good voice in what Sheltered Harbor built for the industry, are the regulators. We started with the US regulators where we were born, and have grown significantly across the globe to regulators, including in Europe. DORA is actually advocating for a lot of the things that Sheltered Harbor already figured out. DORA absolutely advocates for ensuring that you have a backup, and they call it an immutable backup of your data. That's kind of step number one. Here in the US, CISA, not as a regulation, but as part of their guidance, when you look at their ransomware guide, the very first thing they say is isolate a copy of your data. DORA also very specifically says institutions should figure out what are their most critical services and figure out how to stand those up quickly. And that fits exactly with Sheltered Harbor's resilience plan approach. Why did we come up with that? This is long before regulations existed. We came up with that because it was purely a matter of physics, as I call it. You want to stand something up quickly, don't make it the biggest, heaviest thing that you have. Make it the lightest, most important thing first. The regulators around the globe have bought into this concept, and you see not only DORA, but the EU and their directives putting out this, the New York DFS looking for exactly this. This is just normal common sense. To stand up an entire bank or an entire global insurer is going to take a long time if it's completely out. But to stand up the most critical services like giving customers access to their funds or paying claims, these are things that these institutions know I critically need to do just to stay in business. And in some cases, they need to do it to fit regulations, which are not going to be relieved just because they had an operational problem. So, you know, DORA is consistent with the rest of the globe, looking for some pretty standard things, identify what you think is most critical, come up with a way of making sure you can stand them up quickly, and ensure that you have the data to support that.
I would just add a couple of other points to that. There's some regulators like the PCA, FCA in the UK that's very specific and very much like DORA and in Sheltered Harbor rather, that is very specific to the customer outcome. DORA tends to be more around the businesses in general. They're concerned about the EU in general and the fact that an event could bring down the economic system. And so they're very concerned about making sure that the strength of the EU is in part and parcel part of this. Additionally, DORA and other regulators also are very concerned about operational day-to-day activities. You'll see in most of them, they not only want cyber resilience, but they want you to test from an operational perspective that you can recover from the events of corruption and so forth. So they want an improved stance across the full vector of everything you're doing, both operationally, zero trust, cyber, all of the pieces, and they want you to prove it. And if you make significant changes to your environment on a given year, they want you to be able to say, yep, I've tested that too, and I have it. And depending on the country, you have to do certain tests differently, and you have to provide certain pieces to it. But when it comes to a cyber event, you not only have to provide the fact that you can recover from it, But when something does happen, you're going to have to report that it happened. You're going to have to, they're going to be engaged and be kept up to date through the entire process. This is not going to be something you can hide. There's going to be fines and regulatory things that happen if you had the event and you don't keep them up to date. There's also going to be fines and regulatory pieces that happen if you show after the fact that you haven't really put pieces in place to do what you need to do. And in Europe, they already have certain testing that's been going on quietly within certain banks and institutions to show whether or not they can recover. So there's lots of different rules that are coming, but Sheltered Harbor is showing some very stringent and very forthright guidance in a very specific area, which is you as a business, whether you have the regulations or not, you have the fiduciary responsibility to allow your customers access to their assets, their funds. How are you going to do it? Get it down, fine-tuned, test it, and put it in a means in which you can immutably have get the customer up and running later after such an event.
And I think one of the things you mentioned, which I think is true, is they want proof that you're doing it right. The UK, the PRA has, and they actually wrote the original seminal paper around operational resilience, drafted in 2018, released in 2019. And we actually worked with them. They worked independently to create that, but we gave them our update around that time. They loved everything Sheltered Harbor had done because we embodied exactly what they were trying to write up in a white paper then. Roll the calendar forward 2022, where they have very specifics implementations that they want. In fact, in the UK, they have an organization they call the Cross Markets Operational Resilience Group that defined a data vaulting architecture, a technical architecture to vault data in the cloud. We were aware of that because we had met with them when they first formed, and we showed them what we were doing. In 2022, I got a call from the Bank of England asking us if we could certify that architecture. And Sheltered Harbor's response was, we don't certify architectures, we certify implementations, because we're looking for the controls of that whole process, not just the technical piece. What came out of that was a recognition that the Bank of England wasn't happy that there was just a technical architecture and no way of proving it over there. A few months later, they called me back and said, can you do something to certify this? And we said, well, let's take a look at where that architecture landed and see what we can do. And lo and behold, the first few pages of that architecture talk about the architecture principles, which are literally ours. Sheltered Harbor handed to them in early days in 2017. This is what we're doing. This is how we're thinking about this. Those are incorporated into the Sheltered Harbor, into the CMORG architecture. I looked at that and said, okay, went to the Bank of England. I said, we can't certify the architecture, but any institution that implements this architecture and implements Sheltered Harbor's controls, we could certify. The net result of that was the Bank of England said, okay, that's what I'm looking for. Connected us, actually didn't just connect us, they insisted on hosting a meeting between us and the CMORG leaders to get agreement that the UK would actually implement Sheltered Harbor using the CMORG architecture. Everybody's happy. The regulators get what they want. The financial institutions, many of which were kind of holding back because they were hearing the Bank of England wasn't happy, now have reason to move ahead. And that's because Sheltered Harbor had looked at the controls required to maintain that data. Why? Because what we care about is delivering the customer service, not the technical architecture.
And you can see that in the PRA's readings. Yes. I think there's another question too.
Yeah, I see a question from Cliff. Are financial services clients changing or tightening their recovery time objectives and recovery point objective policies today? And again, I know, Rebecca, you talk to financial services participants pretty much on a daily basis, and so do you, Carlos. So what do you see happening in the industry?
We see those, first off, those phrases, to be blunt, are dated, but still relevant. There are new phrases that have come up, and again, you'll see this in different regulatory platforms as well. You know, recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives are good technical phrases. As of when do you want that data? You know, how quickly do you want to be able to recover the technical system? Those are perfectly fine. However, what the regulators have moved toward is it's not the technical system that we care about. It's the delivery of critical services that we care about. It's how do we maintain confidence in our financial system? How do we maintain our economy that the regulators care about? And for that, the focus switches to not just how quickly can you recover the data. Okay, I can recover everybody's accounts in 12 hours. Is that good? It's kind of meaningless if I can't do anything with the recovered data. If, on the other hand, I can actually deliver customer services in a defined window of time, then that's what I care about. So it's not just recovery time objective of the data, recovery time objective of the business service is now relevant. And those different people have different qualifiers on them, but we still have to be able to recover data in some window of time. But we have to recognize that's only a means to an end. Let's measure the end objectives. So still meaningful, but not exclusively meaningful.
So when people use the word RTO, RPO, that's generally people that are looking at it from an IT perspective. The business looks at it from an SLA perspective. They have to have their businesses up and running in a very short period of time. And you hear many times customers talking about certain pieces of their business have zero downtime, zero ability for them to have any non-access, right? And so those critical business functions are a part of, especially in the mainframe world, and we'll talk to the mainframe a little bit, right? Most organizations that still have a mainframe on their floor, they're loving the technology in a lot of the cases now, because it does provide a lot of the nines and the zero, all the tolerances that customers want. But they also, one of the things about the mainframe, though, is everything is very interdependent. And so when we look at our critical business, we really need to say, what are all the pieces of that business? How are we going to tie those pieces together? How are we proving that we can recover them? And what is the business objective to that recovery? RTO and RPO is sometimes two different times. They don't even match, and we don't tie all the pieces together we need to. What the regulations are really saying and businesses want, the largest of the banks that I talk to all tell me the same thing. They can't afford any time. So it's whatever is the most minimal you can create. Now, in a ransom scenario, everybody knows that we're going to have a little bit of a trouble with that, because we're going to have to figure out, when did it happen? How am I going to use my immutable copy? But to the point of Sheltered Harbor, if you don't bring it to the key needs of the business, if you don't test it, and it's the same that they're saying in the regulators, you need to figure out what's key to the business. So this is a business decision that's using the technology. It's not technology driving what the business gets. And that's a change in mentality, because sometimes in the technology, even myself, I always get in the weeds, right? I always want to talk about the bits and bytes and how we're going to get it done. No, it's what does the business need? And then we figure out from a technology perspective how we're going to provide that to the business. And the Sheltered Harbor is providing the framework for that to happen.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rebecca. So I think we have time for one more question before we have to wrap things up here. David asked a very interesting question. It's probably more mainframe specific. So how do modernization efforts on mainframe systems impact their overall security posture? And what steps can be taken to ensure that modernization doesn't introduce new vulnerabilities? How do you conceptualize modernization versus security? I think that's a great question. I'll probably just give you quickly my reaction to that, and then I'll ask you, Rebecca, to chime in, and Carlos, feel free as well, right? I think you're onto a very valid point, David, that modernization and security sometimes, can work against each other. I mean, there's a good reason why, for instance, mainframe customers in South Korea used SNA, so System Network Architecture, for the longest time, as opposed to TCP/IP, because they didn't want to introduce attack vectors from their not so friendly neighbor up north. Right, so there's good examples in that. I do, however, think that modernization is an imperative, just like cyber resilience is an imperative for both for technology and for the business. So we have to make sure that we can get both under the same hat. Right? And some principles to enforce there is, again, that you properly architect modernization efforts, that you properly test those modernization efforts. And in a lot of regards, modernization can even improve your security posture. For instance, the proper use of APIs versus direct database access adds another isolation layer between your backend systems. That is just one example of how modernization can actually help us to improve our security posture. But Rebecca, what are your thoughts to this question?
So for me, modernization isn't just the application layer. Modernization means that we take advantage of the modern tools that are being put in place, whether they're the new threat detection tools that might be had, pervasive encryption, all of the pieces that help protect us and the pieces that were mentioned. Even things maybe like newer tools that are being used from the infrastructure perspective. When we are looking at modernization, are we taking into consideration all the aspects of what's running it underneath? And are we helping our organizations also modernize how we do our backups, how we do our encryption, how we do all of the pieces that move our data around, whether it's we're using a CDA technology, which is very modern and it helps you manage how you're moving data to the cloud, or are you still going to continue using FTP? Are you willing to make those transitions that might be the underpinnings of the application modernization that we're actually trying to do today? And Carlos, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think the question is excellent because with every change, we have to always evaluate what new risks does it bring to us. I talked about the fact that as an industry, finance is quite resilient because we've always thought about that. How do we have a backup that will come up quickly? This concept of primary and secondary systems may be in different regions globally, even the data centers may be, but one is backing up the other, in a what we now call hot basis. That was a modernization that gave us stronger resilience. It's also the modernization that gave us the Achilles heel we have today, that a cyber incident can cross bounds instantaneously. But today's modernization is one that needs to be looked at very carefully and implemented. Zero trust is a great concept, and when implemented properly, it should help. The example that we heard about, the additional isolation layer Eddie mentioned between your data and your applications is a good example. That's an area where you can implement a zero trust architecture with minimally affecting the application logic itself. Modernization can be useful and it can introduce risks. What it basically says is each of us needs to look at every time we introduce something new that we recognize what new avenues of issue that creates for us, whether it's an actual avenue for a cyber attack or an avenue for a cyber event. There's no difference when it comes to your operational requirements.
I would like to add that we need to consider things like pervasive encryption, but also pen testing. We need to be able to test and make sure that we haven't opened any additional risks to our infrastructures by the changes that we're making through our modernization. So we know the tools, we have most of them and we're creating more and we're getting stronger and stronger all the time. But are we willing to incorporate and use them and do the things we need to do? Are we using the threat detection tools that may be coming down? Are we doing the pen testing when we create something new? Are we putting the security tools in place in order for us to be able to secure these new modern as we're doing it? Are we thinking security, resiliency, and the threats that we're facing now in the structures that we're creating as we're modernizing? And I think planning and designing and doing it along those lines will also help us.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I agree. And thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all the participants here for spending some time with us today. Thank you for really a couple of absolutely great questions. I would now hand over to you, Carlos, to wrap things up.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're open for questions anytime you'd like, and obviously the links on the page via QR codes are available for you to find out more about 21CS or Sheltered Harbor. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.